Good afternoon, everyone. So I'm going to, as Juan explained, give you a very brief introduction to our exercise on COVID-19 lessons learned. This is an ongoing exercise. The pandemic is still ongoing, but we've already started to gather information across many areas and really leverage many of the learnings which I'm going to walk you through today. So on to the next one. And this just outlines the things I'm going to cover. So I'm going to say a few words about the main areas that we've had an impact in terms of COVID-19, the big areas where we looked to review our approach and take some lessons learned, and then share some of these interim observations, preliminary conclusions, and then talk a little bit about the key learnings as well as some of the next steps and some of the actions that we're already working on. So COVID-19, now I know COVID-19 has had a tremendous impact on each and every one of us, both on a personal and professional level. And on this slide, really, I've just tried to highlight some of the main areas where it impacted the work of the EMA. Of course, at the outbreak of this new infectious disease, there were no authorized therapeutics or vaccines. So EMA supported development and moved very rapidly to put in place measures to be able to evaluate very swiftly incoming applications for medicines to address this urgent public health need. Now, thankfully, we already had a health threat plan in place. It did not provide all the measures that we needed, but it did enable us to hit the ground running, if you like. And then as we went on, we introduced additional measures to support the particularities of this pandemic. And an example of that is the free scientific advice that was offered to developers. We also had a change to the way we were working with lockdown and the many COVID-related restrictions. And we had to start working remotely at short notice, as I'm sure many of you did. And in fact, little did we know when we were relocating this agency from the UK to the Netherlands because of Brexit, and we were all required to telework, this had set a good groundwork for working remotely in the COVID-19 setting. We also introduced a business continuity plan at agency level, and this really was to make sure that we could dedicate the resources that we needed to COVID-19, but also to work on...
Sorry, can you get close to the mic?
Oh, sorry, yes. Yes, sorry, I'm just going to move close to the mic, so hopefully the people online can hear me now. Do let me know if I need to speak louder. So we had a business continuity plan in place, which enabled us to channel some resource to work on COVID-19 and to really make sure that we could have the assessment and expertise required to review new medicines coming through. And then on the right-hand side, I've just shown a slide which really speaks volumes to the level of interest that we found ourselves, that the visibility of the agency increased immensely in pandemic times. And we saw here, this graph provides a visual of the press, media queries and requests for information coming into the agency. And you'll see that at one point it was sixfold. So we went from 200 a month to 1,200. And so we put in place very swiftly measures to have a dedicated area on our website. We ran press briefings, and we also set up COVID information, stakeholder meetings, and so on to try and meet the demand for information. So on the next slide, this just really highlights the areas that we've looked at. Now, this isn't comprehensive. There were other areas beyond this, but these are the ones I wanted to highlight today. So in terms of COVID-19 products, we looked across the life cycle of the medicines, so the support that the EMA was providing to development, the authorization, the evaluation, but also the monitoring post-authorization and the variations to expand the supply of these vaccines and medicines, as well as related processes, for example, extension of indications. We also look at how workload was managed and how we could address any gaps in resourcing, and there were many. Also, the way we were cooperating with the network, not only our EU partners, but also our fellow regulators at national level, the public health authorities, and of course, you, our stakeholders, importantly, patients, healthcare professionals, as well as academia and the industry. And then we looked at how we had addressed important public health aspects that go beyond core regulatory tasks. And I'm going to give you a couple examples to explain what I mean by this. And then finally, how did we fare in terms of communication and transparency? What were the lessons there? What more can we do? And I would very much welcome your feedback at the end of the presentation on that. On to the next one then, and I'm just going to share some of the preliminary conclusions. So we're 2.5 years into COVID-19 pandemic, and I think it's almost hard to believe that we're still in this pandemic. But as I said, we've spent time, we've had a very thorough review of what we've learned thus far, and I'm going to share with you some of the conclusions. And I'm going to start with the positives. So what were some of the success stories? What worked well? And there were many of those. So for medicinal products for prevention and treatment of COVID-19, we offered enhanced pre-submission dialogue and support to developers. This was done at the level of the EMA Pandemic Task Force, but also through the formal scientific advice process. There's a working party that works together with our main licensing committee, the CHMP. For promising candidates, we also made very rapid, flexible adaptations to our assessment process. So we had rolling reviews. We also accelerated in the post-authorization phase, these all-important variations that were coming through in the early days and associated updates. And then we looked to enable, again, particularly in the early days, these variations to increase supply. And finally, in the area of safety, we worked very vigilantly to make sure that any emerging safety aspects were monitored, and that indeed, if there was a need, that the product information was updated very rapidly. And in terms of the business continuity plan, we did mobilize resources. At one point, at the height of the pandemic, we had around 80 full-time equivalents within the agency working only on COVID-19. And this meant that we were enabled to manage to avoid any procedural delays, to speed up, but also to keep the assessments and ensure there were no delays on the non-COVID-19 medicines as well. Another slide on some of the other things that worked well. I mean, as I mentioned, we had unprecedented visibility, and we worked very hard to address some of these communication needs. We put up a dedicated area of our website, as I mentioned before. We had colleagues within the public engagement department working on key facts. We developed lines to take for the network. We issued public health announcements, and also we worked to enhance transparency exceptionally to meet the demand for information. So we have a clinical data publication policy that's currently on hold. And in the COVID-19 setting, we decided to restart publishing the clinical data. These are the clinical study reports that form the basis for the marketing authorizations for both the COVID-19 vaccines and therapeutics. We also worked very hard to strengthen our cooperation with member state authorities, the Commission, ECDC, and our international partners. We held regular meetings with the Health Commissioner, also with our colleagues across the network, and we had an executive level forum set up with heads of medicines agency that was meeting on a weekly basis. And then also we worked very closely with our international partners. So to make sure that we've kept abreast of emerging information, we worked together to try and define common harmonized approaches to regulatory issues. And this was primarily done through the ICMRA, which is the International Coalition of Medicines Regulatory Authorities. And then finally, the work that the EMA has put in on the COVID-19 has in some form been recognized in the form of the extended mandate. So we now have a formalized ETF. renamed as the Emergency Task Force. We have a group that works specifically on monitoring shortages of medicines. We've expanded also our role into medical devices, looking at shortages, and with the secretariat of these expert panels on medical devices. So that's many of the positives, but of course, in the challenges, we also had many areas where we identified a need for further improvement. These include the need for larger, more multinational, well-designed clinical studies that can provide timely and meaningful results. What we saw was that sometimes there was a fragmented approach to clinical research in some areas, and that more really needs to be done to encourage these large multinational trials. We also recognised that there was a need to extend available data sources and also look at the tools for analysis and IT systems to process them, to improve the data that we have to base our decisions on. And also the need to reserve some of these resource-intensive measures to the most promising medicines. As I mentioned, we sort of put all stops off to really invest in these COVID-19 products, but it was the same teams who were being called upon, and we recognised that in the future there would be a need to decide where we wanted to accelerate and where we would go to a more conservative timetable. In terms of the capacity constraints, there was definitely some challenges here. We did succeed in large part, many thanks to the very long hours and dedication of EMA staff and the members of its committees, and also its stakeholder representatives. I think it was a tremendous collaborative effort. And we realised that there's a need to work more on streamlined processes to deal with the increased workload and to increase capacity in certain areas. There's also a need to work more closely with public health authorities. As I mentioned, we work hand in hand with the medicines regulators at national level, but the public health authorities, the national immunisation technical advisory groups, although we were meeting them with the cooperation of the ECDC, in some aspects, there was divergent views, divergent messaging, which gave rise to some confusion on some of the aspects. So there's definitely more work to be done to collaborate with the NITAGs. And finally, also in the area of communication, as I mentioned, although there are many positives coming out, there are also many learnings. And I'm going to come on to talk about some of those in the last slide. So on to the last couple of slides that I wanted to share today, and this is really to talk about some of the priority action areas, the areas that we're already working on. And the first relates to medicinal product assessment. So we're working now on improving the timely availability of data post-authorization. So this includes through the Darwin EU system, which will enable us to really gather data, compile it and analyze it and feed into the all-important decision-making process. We also are co-sponsoring a vaccine monitoring platform together with ECDC, which will look at procuring studies to look at the effectiveness and safety of vaccines. And this will complement, of course, the studies that are undertaken by the marketing authorization holders themselves. In terms of improving the timely availability of early preliminary data, what we saw was that in the COVID-19 space, there was a lot of interim results that were being published or being discussed externally. And we recognized that there was a need to have a mechanism to bring into the agency, into the review process, these interim results very early. So that's one of the learnings that we're working on. Also, the rolling reviews. For those of you who aren't familiar with the rolling review process, this really enables us to speed up by the assessors starting to review data packages as and when they become available, rather than waiting for a whole package of quality non-clinical and clinical data to be published in one go. And that really means that sometimes the lion's share of the work, particularly in the quality and non-clinical, can be done. And then when the final piece, which is that all-important confirmatory clinical trial comes in, it means that the assessment, the decision, can be concluded very rapidly. But there's needs to look at the experience with rolling reviews in the crisis setting, but also in the non-crisis setting, to see how we can use it in the future with all of the experience we've gained, and apply it for these very promising products, for example, in the PRIME scheme. Also, regarding the assessment process itself, we need to work more with the companies, with the industry, on making sure that the planning is more robust, and that the submissions, when they come in, are mature enough. As I mentioned, that with the resource constraints that we had, if rapporteurs and their teams were tied up expecting an application to come in and it did not materialize, it meant that they could not immediately work on something else. And equally, if a dossier came in and it wasn't complete, then it's again a wasted effort. So there's a need to look at that in the incoming in terms of the process. Also, the way that the assessment process itself is undertaken, and making sure that we focus on those main objection issues that would prevent a marketing authorization being recommended, and not getting lost in some of these detailed clarification issues. So really focusing on the main points in the assessment team. And then more work to be done on rationalizing further the review process and also the assessment reports, again, based on the wealth of experience that we've gained with this crisis. And then finally, regarding resourcing, we have managed to cope in the business continuity setting, but there's definitely more to be done in the way that we allocate resource. And we now have set up a tactical group together with our colleagues in the Heads of Medicines Agency to look at how we can plan better the workload coming in, the assessment workload, looking at strengthening the training of the assessment teams, and also the extended use of multinational assessment teams, where you take, a quality assessor from one country, a non-clinical assessor from somewhere else, and a clinical assessor from somewhere else, and you gain experience and you have a very agile team that can be put together with the best expertise. And finally, looking at expanding the pool of available expertise to draw upon to support that all-important assessment process. And then just to finish up on the area of engagement with partners and stakeholders and communication, I've already mentioned the need to strengthen our cooperation with the NITAGs. There's also a need to strengthen the cooperation with those marketing authorization holders who have authorized medicines who might be of interest in the COVID-19 setting or another crisis setting. Equally, there's a need to establish networks to enable information to flow more freely between the different partners, including the public health authorities. The need to work further to ensure we align our messages with those partners, and looking at reinforcing the framework to ensure that we have agile scientific assessments to underpin communication. And one of the areas I can give as an example that goes perhaps beyond our usual communication on medicines, which the EMA has reviewed, is during the COVID-19 pandemic, the ETF, for example, issued a statement advising against, for example, the use of the veterinary medicine ivermectin in COVID-19. Equally, there's a need to further strengthen our supports to member states. So by sharing our communication material, enabling it to be tailored at member state level to be translated, to make the best use of that. And also in terms of leveraging the high public attention that we've received, we're now looking at how we can build on the positive experience we've had with the press briefings, but also to see how we can increase those all-important contacts with the general media. We're also looking to further strengthen our approach to communication, including the way we communicate. So looking at how we can use data visualization more, how we can use a test with our stakeholder groups to make sure that the message is conveyed in the most meaningful way, and also looking to build on best practice in terms of countering misinformation. And finally, to build on, again, the very important experience we've had in this exceptional transparency environment to look at rolling that out also to other products. And one example we have with COVID-19 is we moved to publish the full risk management plan. Normally we publish a summary of the risk management, but in COVID times we published the full risk management plan. And now we are taking that forward also for other new active substances, and it will be eventually rolled out for all medicines that come through the EMA for the evaluation. I think that's my last slide. So I think the next one is the closing slide. And here I'd like to just ask you, I mean, it's interesting to share as far as we've got with this exercise, but I would be really welcome your views on those areas. What has been your perspectives on what's worked well? Where can we further improve? And any other comments or feedback that you would have. Thank you very much.